she rejected the Galactic Accord, and Earth stood with her. Part 2. The news reached Earth before Elena's shuttle did. Someone in the amphitheater had recorded the moment and transmitted it through the Concorde's open communication network. Within an hour, every screen on every continent was playing the same clip. A woman in a dark uniform, standing before an alien tribunal, speaking 7 words that changed everything. Earth respectfully declines the Galactic Accord. By the time Elena's shuttle broke through the atmosphere and descended toward the Geneva spaceport, the world was already tearing itself apart over what she had done. Half the networks were calling her a hero, the other half were calling her a fool. Street protests erupted in 12 major cities before noon. In New York, thousands gathered in Central Park holding signs that read, "She spoke for all of us." In Beijing, government officials issued a cautious statement calling for calm. In London, a crowd outside Parliament demanded answers from their representatives on the United Earth Council. The council itself was in chaos. Chair Nathan Perry, a careful politician who had spent months building support for ratification, called an emergency session the moment Elena's shuttle was confirmed inbound. Perry was not a man who liked surprises. He had built his career on predictability, on steady progress, on not rocking boats. Elena had just capsized the entire fleet. Elena landed at Geneva under heavy security. Armed escorts walked her from the shuttle pad to an armored vehicle. Through the tinted windows, she could see the crowds lining the road. Some cheered, some threw things. Ben Harris sat beside her, with his jaw set and his eyes moving constantly. The council chamber was a large, circular room beneath the old United Nations building, refitted for the modern era, with holographic displays and translation systems. 12 representatives sat in a curved row behind a raised desk. Perry sat at the center, his face unreadable. Elena took her seat at the witness table. Daniel Ortiz sat beside her with a data tablet containing everything they had found. Perry opened the proceedings. He did not raise his voice, but his words were sharp. He asked Elena on what authority she had made the decision to reject a treaty that the council had provisionally approved. He reminded her that she had been sent to the threshold as a representative, not a decision-maker. He said that her actions may have condemned Earth to isolation from the most powerful alliance in galactic history. Elena listened without interrupting. When Perry finished, she asked permission to present evidence. Perry hesitated, then granted it. Elena stood and activated the display. She brought up the full text of the Galactic Accord, not the summary version that had been circulated to council members, but the complete document with all articles, subclauses, and appendices. She told the chamber that what they had voted on was an outline. What the Concorde had asked them to sign was something very different. She read Article 47 aloud, the military surrender clause. She read Article 62, the population audits. She read Article 71, the forced relocation mandate. And she read the amendment provision, or rather the lack of one, the clause that made the accord permanent and unchangeable without the unanimous consent of 900 species. The chamber was silent. Then Representative Lisa Cole from the North American bloc spoke. She asked why these clauses had not been included in the preliminary briefings. Daniel Ortiz answered. He explained that the Concorde had provided the summary document in a format that was technically complete, but structured in a way that made the critical articles nearly impossible to find without a deliberate search. He said it was not an accident. The room erupted. Representatives shouted questions. Some demanded to see the original documents. Others turned on Perry, asking why his office had not conducted a more thorough review. Perry's face went red, then white. He called for order 3 times before the chamber quieted. Outside the building, Grace Nolan was already at work. Elena had asked her to do one thing and one thing only: get the truth out. Grace contacted journalists, independent media outlets, and university researchers. She gave them the full treaty text, authenticated and verified. She asked them to read it and tell the public what they found. By the end of the second day, every major news organization on Earth had published detailed analyses of the Accord's hidden terms. Legal scholars called the forced relocation clauses a violation of basic sovereign rights. Military analysts said the surrender of Earth's defense forces would leave humanity completely dependent on the Concord for protection. Historians pointed out that similar arrangements throughout human history had always ended the same way, with the weaker party losing everything. Public opinion shifted like a wave. Polls that had shown 60% support for ratification flipped almost overnight. By the end of the first week, 63% of Earth's population supported Elena's decision. By the end of the second week, it was 71%. Nathan Perry read the numbers. He was a politician, and politicians understand numbers. He quietly dropped the formal inquiry against Elena. He did not apologize, and he did not thank her. But he stopped calling for her removal. But Earth's problems were only beginning. The Concord responded to the rejection with cold efficiency. Within days of Elena's refusal, all trade agreements between Earth and Concord member species were frozen. Supply contracts for rare minerals, advanced alloys, and medical compounds were suspended. Concord ships that had been patrolling the space near Earth's system as part of the Provisional Protection Arrangement withdrew without warning or explanation. A formal communiqué arrived from the Concord High Chamber. It was addressed to the United Earth Council and written in the dry, precise language of galactic diplomacy. It stated that Earth had 60 standard days to reconsider its position and ratify the accord. If Earth failed to do so, it would be permanently classified as a non-aligned world, excluded from all Concord protections, trade networks, and diplomatic channels. The message carried no direct threats. It did not need to. Everyone understood what permanent exclusion meant. Earth would be alone in a galaxy full of civilizations that were older, stronger, and more advanced. Elena met privately with Admiral Kevin Holt in a secure room beneath the Swiss Alps. Holt was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with gray hair cut close to his skull, and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He had commanded Earth's small fleet during the border skirmishes that first brought humanity to the Concord's attention, and he was the only military leader Elena fully trusted. She asked him for an honest assessment. Holt did not sugarcoat it. Earth had 14 capital ships, 32 escorts of various sizes, and a network of orbital defense platforms that was still only half complete. The fleet was brave, the crews were well trained, but against the combined military power of the Concord, they would last perhaps a week if it came to a real fight. Elena asked him if he thought she had made the right decision. Holt leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then he said that right and smart are not always the same thing, but in this case, he believed they might be. He said he would rather fight for a free Earth than serve in someone else's navy. Elena nodded. She thanked him and stood to leave. At the door, she paused and asked him one more question. She asked if he could buy her time if it came to that. Holt looked at her with steady eyes and said he could buy her enough. 53 days remained. Elena went back to her office, sat down at her desk, and began to plan. She was not going to wait for the deadline to pass. She was not going to sit and hope the Concord would change its mind. She was going to find another way. She pulled up a star chart on her display and began looking for allies. She rejected the Galactic Accord, and Earth stood with her. Part 3. The galaxy was not as unified as the Concord wanted everyone to believe. Elena had learned that much from 10 years of studying interstellar politics. For every species that sat comfortably inside the Alliance, There were others that existed on the edges, forgotten or cast aside. These were the species that had been expelled, the ones that had been denied entry, and the few that had simply walked away before the chains could tighten. They had no name for themselves. The Concord called them the unaligned. Elena called them a chance. She began with the Dravani. They were a reptilian species from a dry, rocky world, 300 light-years from Earth. 2 centuries ago, they had been full members of the Concord. Then they had refused a population redistribution order, the same kind of order buried in Article 71 of the Accord. The Concord had expelled them, stripped their trade access, and left them to struggle alone in a hostile region of space. The Dravani had survived. They were tough, stubborn, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. Getting a meeting with them was not easy. Elena sent 17 diplomatic messages before receiving a single reply. The reply was short. It gave coordinates for a neutral station in deep space and a time. Nothing else. Elena traveled alone except for Daniel Ortiz and a small security team. The station was old, a decommissioned mining platform drifting in the dark between 2 dead star systems. The Dravani ambassador was waiting in a bare metal room with no furniture except 2 chairs and a table. His name was difficult for human tongues, so he told Elena to call him Ren. He was old, even by Dravani standards. His scales were faded and scarred, and one of his eyes was cloudy and half-closed. But the other eye watched Elena with a sharpness that made her feel like every thought in her head was being read. She told him what had happened. She showed him the treaty. She explained the clauses and told him that Earth had refused to sign. Ren listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, and what he said changed everything Elena thought she understood about the Concord. He told her that the relocation clauses were not about logistics. They were not about managing populations or distributing resources efficiently across the galaxy. They were about control. The Concord moved populations deliberately, breaking apart communities, separating families from their home worlds, scattering species across dozens of planets where they became minorities dependent on Concord infrastructure for survival. A species that could not gather on its own world could not organize. It could not resist. It could not say no. The Dravani had learned this the hard way. When they refused the relocation order, they had expected negotiation. Instead, the Concord had moved immediately to cut them off. Trade gone overnight. Allies pressured into silence. Within a year, the Dravani were alone and starving. They survived only because their homeworld had enough natural resources to sustain them without imports, and because their people were willing to endure decades of hardship rather than surrender. Elena asked Ren why no one in the galaxy talked about this. Why was the truth about the Concord not common knowledge? Ren made a sound that might have been a laugh. He told her that everyone knew. Every species inside the Concord understood exactly what the system was. But by the time they understood, they had already signed. Their militaries were gone. Their populations were scattered. Their economies were dependent on Concord trade. They had no power to resist, even if they wanted to. The Accord was designed that way. It gave everything up front and took everything away slowly, so gradually that most species did not realize what they had lost until it was far too late. Elena sat with that knowledge in silence for a full minute. Then she asked Ren if he would help Earth. Ren studied her with his one good eye. He said he would think about it. That was all. Elena returned to Earth and immediately called a meeting with her team. Daniel Ortiz spent the next 3 weeks building a case. He reached out to academic contacts, intelligence analysts, and independent researchers across human space. He cross-referenced Concord public records with accounts from expelled species, leaked internal documents, and historical data that the Concord had tried to bury. The picture that emerged was devastating. Over 4,000 years, the Concord had absorbed hundreds of species. In nearly every case, the pattern was the same. A provisional membership period filled with gifts and promises. Then the accord, presented as a formality. Then, within a generation, the slow dismantling of the species' independence. Military forces dissolved, population centers broken apart, cultural institutions quietly defunded and replaced with Concord-approved alternatives. Within 3 generations, most species had lost their original language, their traditions, and any memory of what independence had felt like. It was not conquest. It was something worse. It was erasure done so gently that the victims thanked their captors for it. Elena presented Daniel's findings to the United Earth Council in a closed session. The representatives sat in stunned silence as the data scrolled across their screens. Even Nathan Perry, who had spent months advocating for ratification, said nothing. Meanwhile, the Concord was not sitting idle. A diplomatic envoy arrived in Earth orbit, led by a humanoid alien called Liaison Dremeth. Dremeth was from a species called the Tessari, known throughout the galaxy for their skill in negotiation. He was tall, slender, and handsome in a way that seemed almost designed to put humans at ease. His voice was warm, his smile was constant, and his eyes missed nothing. Dremeth requested meetings with individual council members. He was granted access, despite Elena's objections. Over the course of 2 weeks, he met with nearly every representative. He was charming and reasonable in each meeting. He offered private assurances. He hinted at concessions. He suggested that the troublesome clauses could be softened informally, even if they could not be changed on paper. And in quieter moments, behind closed doors, he reminded each representative of what the Concord's military could do if diplomacy failed. Elena confronted Dremeth at a formal reception hosted by the council. She found him standing near a window with a glass in his hand, looking out at the night sky over Geneva. She asked him directly whether the Concord had ever intended to give Earth a real choice. Dremeth smiled and said that choice was always available. He said the Concord simply wanted to make sure Earth understood all the options clearly. Elena told him that she understood perfectly. She said that the clearest option was the one she had already chosen. Dremeth's smile did not waver. He told her she was brave. He also told her that bravery and survival were not the same thing. The deadline was now 14 days away. Elena called for a globally broadcast session of the United Earth Council. The chamber was packed. Every screen on the planet carried the feed. People watched in homes, offices, schools, and hospitals. They watched in refugee camps and on space stations. They watched on the colony at Proxima Centauri, where the signal arrived 8 minutes late. Elena stood at the podium. She did not raise her voice. She spoke simply, the way her father would have spoken, plain words without decoration. She told them what the accord really was. She told them about the hidden clauses, about the Dravani, about the pattern of quiet absorption that the Concord had perfected over thousands of years. She said that signing the accord would bring comfort and security, but it would cost humanity everything that made it human. Then she asked one question. She asked whether humanity had crossed the distance between the stars just to hand the keys to someone else. The vote was called. 12 representatives, 12 votes. The result was unanimous. Earth formally and permanently rejected the Galactic Accord. When the result was announced, Elena heard something she had not expected. It came from outside the chamber, from the streets of Geneva, carried through the open windows on the cold night air. It was the sound of people cheering. 4 days later, the deadline passed. The Concord declared Earth a non-aligned sovereign world. All protections withdrawn. All trade severed. All channels closed. Earth stood alone in the dark. But it stood. She rejected the Galactic Accord. and Earth stood with her. Part 4. 6 months passed. Earth survived, but it was not easy. The loss of Concord trade hit hard and fast. Advanced medical compounds that had been imported from alien worlds ran out within weeks. Rare minerals used in the construction of faster-than-light drives became scarce. The colony on Proxima Centauri, which had depended on regular supply runs through Concord-controlled space lanes, was forced to ration food and water. But humans adapted. They always did. Factories that had shut down years ago were reopened. Scientists worked double shifts to find substitutes for alien materials. Farmers on Proxima stretched their harvests further than anyone thought possible. It was hard, and people were angry, and some nights Elena lay awake, wondering if she had traded humanity's future for a principle. But every morning she got up and went back to work. Admiral Kevin Holt used the 6 months well. The shipyards on Luna and in the asteroid belt ran day and night. 8 new frigates were commissioned and crewed. The orbital defense network around Earth was completed ahead of schedule. Recruitment surged as young men and women from every nation signed up to serve. Among them was a 24-year-old pilot from Nebraska named Katie Brennan. Katie had grown up on a wheat farm outside a small town that most people had never heard of. She had planned to study agriculture at the state university. But the night Elena's rejection was broadcast, Katie had sat at the kitchen table with her family and watched the clip play over and over on the old screen above the stove. Her father had not said much. Her mother had cried, though Katie was not sure if it was from fear or pride. Her younger brother Sam, who was 16, had looked at her and asked what was going to happen now. But the next morning, she drove to the nearest recruitment office and enlisted in the Earth Defense Fleet. 6 months later, she was a full lieutenant, assigned to the escort frigate Steadfast, running patrol routes along the edge of the solar system. She was on patrol the morning the Concord fleet arrived. The first warning came from the long-range sensor station on Pluto's moon. A massive energy signature had appeared at the boundary of the solar system, consistent with hundreds of ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel simultaneously. Within minutes, the signature resolved into a clear picture. 312 warships from a dozen Concord member species, arranged in a wide formation that stretched across millions of kilometers. At the center of the formation sat a Keth Dominion dreadnought, a ship so large that Earth sensors initially classified it as a small moon. It simply sat at the edge of the system and waited, like a wall. Admiral Holt was briefed within the hour. He took the information calmly, the way he took everything, and then began issuing orders. Earth's fleet, 22 capital ships and escorts, plus the orbital defense network, moved into a defensive formation around the inner system. It was a thin line against a very large force. Holt knew it. Everyone knew it. Elena was woken at 3 in the morning by a call from Grace Nolan. She dressed quickly and took a car to the command bunker beneath the Alps. By the time she arrived, the situation was clear. The Concord fleet was not attacking. It was blockading. Nothing would enter or leave the solar system without their permission. The effects were immediate. The supply route to Proxima Centauri was cut. Mining ships in the outer asteroid belt were ordered to return to Earth or face interception. Communication relays that passed through Concord space were jammed. Earth was sealed inside its own system, like a bottle with the cap screwed tight. A formal message arrived from the Concord fleet commander, a Keth admiral whose name translated roughly as Voice of Stone. The message was brief. It stated that the blockade would remain in place until Earth reconsidered its position regarding the Galactic Accord. It offered no timeline. It made no threats beyond the blockade itself. It did not need to. The message was the blockade, and the blockade said everything. Elena asked Holt what their options were. Holt laid them out plainly. They could fight, and they would lose. They could wait, and they would slowly starve. or they could find a third option that nobody had thought of yet. Elena chose the third option. She sent a message into deep space, not through Concorde channels which were blocked, but through an old, slow, human-built relay network that predated first contact. The signal was weak and would take days to reach its destination. It was addressed to Ren, the Dravani ambassador. While they waited, life on Earth changed. Rationing began for the first time since the old wars. Power grids were reduced to essential services during certain hours. People lined up for food distributions in cities that had not seen hunger in generations. The mood was tense, but it was not broken. Grace Nolan, now working full-time as a public communications coordinator, broadcast daily updates that were honest about the situation, but steady in tone. She told people the truth. She told them it was hard, and she told them that giving up was not on the table. Katie Brennan wrote a letter to her brother Sam during a quiet shift aboard the Steadfast. She told him that she was scared. She told him that the Concorde fleet was the largest thing she had ever seen, and that her little frigate felt like a rowboat in the middle of an ocean. But she also told him that she was exactly where she wanted to be. She said she would rather be scared and free than comfortable and owned. She asked him to tell their parents she loved them, just in case. 3 weeks into the blockade, something appeared on Earth's sensors. A small group of ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the far side of the solar system, away from the Concorde fleet. They were old ships, battered and patched, but they were armed. They were Dravani. Ren's voice came through the communication relay, rough and distorted by distance. He said simply that they had come. Behind the Dravani ships, more appeared. A cluster of sleek, dark vessels from the Ven Collective, a species of networked intelligences that had left the Concorde 100 years ago. Then came the Orali, a species of builders who had been denied Concorde membership for refusing to share their construction techniques. Then the Senth, small and fierce, who had been expelled for harboring refugees from Concorde relocation programs. They arrived in ones and twos and small groups over the course of a week. None of them were powerful. Most of their ships were old, some barely held together. But they came. One by one, they took positions behind Earth's fleet, forming a second line that stretched across the system. Elena watched the tactical display in the bunker as each new group appeared. She did not cry. She was too tired for that. But something in her chest loosened for the first time in months. The Concorde fleet commander sent a new message. This one was addressed directly to Elena. It stated that the presence of unaligned species in Earth's system was an act of provocation, and that the Concorde would not be deterred by a collection of outcasts and failures. Elena read the message. Then she drafted her reply. She showed it to Daniel, who suggested changes. She showed it to Grace, who suggested different changes. She showed it to Holt, who read it once and said it was fine as it was. The reply was short. It told the Concorde that Earth's answer had not changed, that it would not change, and that if the Concorde wished to take by force what could not be given freely, then it would learn what humanity and its friends were willing to pay for their freedom. The Concorde fleet commander responded with a final ultimatum. Earth had 48 hours to surrender its sovereignty and ratify the accord, or the blockade would be enforced by direct military action. Elena gathered her team in the bunker. Daniel, Grace, Holt, and Katie Brennan, who had been called in from the Steadfast to represent the fleet's junior officers. They sat around the table and looked at each other in the low light. 48 hours. That was all the time they had left. She asked if anyone wanted to change their mind. Nobody spoke. She nodded. Then she told them to get some rest, because tomorrow was going to be a long day. Nobody slept. She rejected the Galactic Accord, and Earth stood with her. Part 5. The last hours were the quietest. Across the planet, people stopped what they were doing and looked up. There was nothing to see, not with the naked eye. The battle, if it came, would happen far beyond the reach of human sight. Out past the orbit of Neptune, where two fleets faced each other in the cold silence between worlds. But people looked up anyway, because that was all they could do. Admiral Holt stood on the bridge of the flagship, the EDS Resolve. The ship was not the largest in Earth's fleet, but it was the best armed and the fastest to respond. Holt had chosen it as his command vessel because it reminded him of the destroyers he had served on as a young officer. Compact, tough, and built to take a beating. Around him, his bridge crew worked in focused silence. Sensor operators tracked the Concorde fleet's movements. Weapons officers ran final checks. Communications officers monitored every channel. Aboard the Steadfast, Katie Brennan sat in the pilot's seat and watched the tactical display on her console. The Concorde fleet was a wall of red markers stretching across her screen, so many that they blurred together at the edges. Earth's fleet was a thin blue line in front of them. The Allied ships from the Dravani and the other unaligned species formed a second line behind, their markers scattered and uneven, like stars in a cloudy sky. Katie took a slow breath and placed her hands on the controls. In the bunker beneath Geneva, Elena stood before the main tactical display with her arms at her sides. Grace Nolan sat at the communication station, ready to broadcast to the world. Daniel Ortiz stood near the back of the room with a tablet in his hands, running through contingency plans that they both knew would not matter if the Concorde chose to attack with full force. The countdown reached 0. The Concorde fleet began to move. 300 warships advanced in a slow, deliberate formation, closing the distance between the edge of the system and Earth's defensive line. The Keth Dreadnought, at the center of the formation, powered up its main weapons array, and the energy signature lit up every sensor in the solar system like a second sun. Holt gave the order to hold position. Earth's fleet did not retreat. The Allied ships behind them held as well. 22 human warships, and perhaps 40 alien vessels of varying age and condition, stood in the path of the largest military force any of them had ever seen. Then something happened that no one expected. A transmission cut through every channel simultaneously, overriding Concorde encryption and human frequencies alike. It came from inside the Concorde fleet. A single ship, a mid-sized cruiser flying the colors of the Palathi species, broke formation. It moved sideways, away from the advancing wall, and came to a stop in the empty space between the two fleets. Its captain broadcast a message in clear, unencrypted language that every ship on both sides could hear. The captain said that the Palathi people had joined the Concorde 400 years ago because they believed in cooperation and mutual respect. He said that what was happening here was neither of those things. He said that his ship would not fire on a world that had simply asked to be left alone. The transmission ended. The Palathi cruiser sat motionless in the gap, alone and exposed. For a moment, nothing else moved. Then a second ship broke formation. It was a small destroyer from a species called the Oresi, a quiet people known for their skill in engineering. The destroyer moved to a position beside the Palathi cruiser and broadcast its own message. It said the same thing in different words. Then 3 more ships broke away, then 7, then 20. Inside the Concorde fleet, the formation began to fracture. Ships peeled away in 1s and 2s and small clusters. Some moved to neutral positions between the fleets. Others crossed the gap entirely and joined Earth's line, their captains broadcasting messages of solidarity as they came. The messages were in dozens of languages, some translated and some not, but the meaning was the same. Not like this. The Keth Admiral ordered the remaining fleet to hold. The advance stopped. The Dreadnought's weapons array powered down, its glow fading from the sensors like a dying ember. On the bridge of the Resolve, Holt watched the tactical display as the red markers scattered and rearranged. He did not smile, he did not celebrate. He simply exhaled, long and slow, and told his crew to maintain position. Katie Brennan watched the same display from the Steadfast. A Palathi cruiser was now sitting less than 1,000 kilometers from her frigate, close enough that she could see its running lights through the viewport. She stared at it for a long time. Then she let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, and relaxed her grip on the controls. In the bunker, Elena watched the fractures spread across the tactical display like cracks in ice. Grace looked up from her station and asked what was happening. She said she was not entirely sure, but she thought the galaxy was waking up. Far away, aboard the Threshold station, the Concorde Hide Chamber convened an emergency session. The circular chamber that had witnessed Elena's refusal months ago was now filled with shouting, accusations, and something the Concorde had not experienced in 4,000 years of existence: genuine internal dissent. The Palathi representative stood and read the same hidden clauses that Elena had flagged: the military surrender, the population relocations, the permanent binding. He asked the assembled delegates how many of their homeworlds had been reshaped without their people's true understanding or consent. No one answered, but the silence was answer enough. The session dissolved without resolution. No vote was taken, no statement was issued. The cracks that Elena's refusal had opened were now running through the foundation of the Concorde itself. In the solar system, the Keth Admiral received new orders from the High Chamber. The orders were simple: withdraw. The blockade fleet turned slowly, like a great beast changing direction, and began to pull away from Earth's system. It took hours for the last ships to clear the sensor range. When they were gone, the space around Earth was open and clear for the first time in months. There was no grand treaty, no formal surrender, no dramatic moment of victory. The Concorde simply left. And in leaving, it acknowledged something it had never acknowledged in 4,000 years: that a single world had said no, and that no had held. The days that followed were busy and strange. Earth's economy had to be rebuilt. Supply lines had to be reopened. The colony on Proxima Centauri needed emergency shipments. There was too much work to do for anyone to stop and celebrate properly. But Elena was already looking ahead. She reached out to the Dravani, the Palathi, the Ven Collective, and every other species that had stood with Earth during the blockade. She proposed something new. Not an alliance like the Concorde, built on control and hidden chains, but a compact built on a single principle: that sovereignty was something kept, not something given away. She called it the Free Worlds Compact. The Dravani were the first to join. Ren, the old ambassador with the scarred scales and the one good eye, pressed his mark on the founding document and told Elena that he had waited 200 years for someone to do what she had done. The Palathi followed. Then the Ven, the Orali, the Senth, and a dozen others who had been watching from the shadows and waiting for proof that resistance was possible. The founding charter was drafted by Daniel Ortiz in a small office in Geneva, working late into the night with coffee and old law books. The document was simple and clear, written in plain language that any species could understand. It began with a single line taken from Elena's speech to the council. The line read, "Sovereignty is not granted, it is kept." Admiral Holt retired a year after the blockade. At his farewell ceremony on the Resolve, surrounded by officers who had served with him during the longest days of the crisis, he gave a short speech. He said that he had spent his entire career preparing for a war. He said the war never came. And he said the reason it never came was because one woman decided that freedom was not something you could negotiate away, no matter how good the offer looked. Katie Brennan was promoted and given command of a new patrol ship, assigned to escort trade convoys along the free space lanes that were being established between compact worlds. On her first day in command, she stood on the bridge and looked out at the stars, and thought about the letter she had written to her brother Sam during the blockade. She had told him she was scared. She had been right to be scared. But she had also been right to stay. Grace Nolan became the Compact's first communications director, responsible for maintaining open channels between member worlds. She approached the job the same way she had approached every crisis during the past year, with honesty, clarity, and a refusal to let fear control the message. Elena did not attend Holt's ceremony. She was not on Earth. She was aboard a small diplomatic vessel at the edge of explored space, orbiting a world that had just made first contact with the wider galaxy. The species that lived there was young and cautious. They had detected signals from both the Concorde and the Compact, and they did not know which to trust. Their ambassador met Elena in a sparse room on an orbital platform that smelled like copper and rain. He was nervous. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke through the translation system. He told Elena that his people had heard of the Concorde. They had heard of the Accord, and they had heard of the woman who had refused to sign it. He asked her what they should do. Elena smiled. It was a tired smile, worn around the edges, but it was real. She told him that she could not make that decision for his people. She said that no one should make that decision for them. But she said that if they wanted to stand on their own terms, in their own way, with friends who would respect that, then they had come to the right place. The ambassador looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out his hand, a gesture his species had borrowed from watching human broadcasts, and Elena took it. Outside the viewport, the galaxy stretched in every direction, vast and dark and full of unknowns. The Concorde was still out there, still powerful, still watching. The cracks in its foundation were growing, but slowly. The Free World's Compact was still small, still young, still finding its footing. But Earth stood, the Compact grew, and the idea that had started with one woman standing in a silent amphitheater and saying no continued to spread through the stars, quiet and steady and unstoppable, like light moving through the dark. She rejected the Galactic Accord, and Earth stood with her. Part 1. The station called the Threshold hung in the darkness above Earth, like a silver ring caught between the planet and the stars. It was not built by human hands. The Galactic Concorde, an alliance of over 900 alien civilizations, had placed it there 10 years ago as a gift when humanity first made contact. It was meant to be a bridge between Earth and the rest of the galaxy. But on that cold morning in the year 2187, Commander Elena Marsh looked out through the observation window and thought it felt more like a cage. She had been summoned 3 days earlier. A formal message from the Concorde High Chamber had arrived at Earth's diplomatic office in Geneva, sealed with the crystalline signature of High Arbiter Vashon. The message was polite. It was also not a request. Earth's provisional membership period was ending, and the time had come to sign the Galactic Accord, the binding treaty that would make humanity a permanent member of the Concorde. Elena had read the treaty once on the shuttle ride up. She read it again in her quarters aboard the Threshold. And then she called her team into the small briefing room at the end of the corridor and told them to sit down. There were 3 of them. Lieutenant Daniel Ortiz was her legal advisor, a quiet man with sharp eyes who had spent 15 years studying interstellar law. Grace Nolan was her communications officer, quick with words and good at reading a room. And there was Corporal Ben Harris, her security escort, who stood near the door and listened with his arms folded. Elena placed the treaty document on the table. It was displayed on a thin screen that glowed faintly in the dim room. She told Daniel to walk them through the terms, starting with the sections the Concorde had not highlighted during the preliminary briefings. Daniel leaned forward and scrolled past the opening pages. The first half of the treaty was everything Earth had been promised. technology sharing, free passage through Concord space lanes, medical advances, protection under the Collective Defense Pact. It was generous, it was exciting, it was the reason most of the United Earth Council back home had already voted in favor of ratification. But then Daniel reached Article 47. He read it aloud. The clause stated that upon ratification, all member species would submit their independent military forces to the authority of the Concord Joint Command. Earth's fleet, its ships, its soldiers, its orbital defense systems would no longer answer to Earth. Grace shifted in her seat. She asked if that was standard for all member species. Every species that had signed the accord had agreed to the same terms. He continued, Article 62 required all member worlds to submit to population audits conducted by Concord-appointed overseers every 5 standard years. Article 71 authorized the Concord to relocate segments of a member species population to designated colony worlds, chosen not by the species itself, but by the Concord's Central Planning Bureau. The room went quiet. Elena could hear the low hum of the station's life support system and nothing else. She asked Daniel one question. She asked whether the accord could be amended after signing. He told her no. The treaty was written in perpetuity. Any amendment required a unanimous vote of all 900 member species. In 4,000 years of the Concord's existence, not a single amendment had ever passed. Elena stood and walked to the window. Earth filled the lower half of the glass, blue and white and impossibly beautiful. She thought about her father, Carl Marsh, a retired Marine who lived alone in a small house in Virginia. He had told her once, when she was still a teenager arguing about college choices, that the worst deals are the ones that look too good at first glance. She had rolled her eyes at the time. She was not rolling her eyes now. That evening, she requested a private audience with High Arbiter Vashon. The Keth Dominion diplomat received her in a chamber filled with pale blue light. Vashon was tall, nearly 8 feet, with a segmented body covered in dark chitin and eyes that reflected the light like polished stones. He moved slowly and spoke with a deep, layered voice that the translation system smoothed into something almost musical. Elena did not waste time on pleasantries. She asked Vashon directly whether any species had ever left the accord after ratification. Vashon was still for a long moment. His mandibles clicked softly, a gesture that Elena had learned meant discomfort. Then he answered. He said no. He said the question itself was considered an insult among Concord species. Elena thanked him and left. She did not sleep that night. She sat in her quarters with the treaty open on the screen and read every clause, every subarticle, every footnote. By morning, she had made her decision. She told no one except Daniel, who simply looked at her and nodded, as if he had been waiting for it. The ratification ceremony was held in the grand amphitheater at the heart of the threshold. It was an enormous circular hall with tiered seating that rose toward a dome ceiling made of transparent material, so the stars themselves seemed to watch the proceedings. Delegations from dozens of species filled the tiers. The chamber buzzed with alien voices, clicks, hums, and frequencies that human ears could barely register. Elena, Daniel, Grace, Ben Harris, and 4 junior diplomats. They took their seats near the center of the floor, surrounded on all sides by representatives of civilizations far older and far more powerful than their own. High Arbiter Vashon stood at the central podium and read the accord in full. The translation systems worked in real time, converting his words into 900 languages simultaneously. When the reading was complete, he invited each provisional species to step forward and press its mark upon the binding tablet, a crystalline device that recorded consent at a molecular level. 3 species went before Earth. The first was a small amphibian people called the Orvashi. Their delegates stepped forward, pressed a webbed hand to the tablet, and returned to their seat. The second was a tall, feathered species from a world near the galactic core. They too pressed their mark without hesitation. The third species did the same. Then Voshan called Earth. Elena stood. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the amphitheater. Some were curious, some were indifferent. A few, she thought, looked almost hungry. She walked to the podium. Her boots clicked against the polished floor, and the sound seemed too loud in the sudden quiet. She looked at the binding tablet. It glowed faintly, waiting for her touch. She looked at Voshan. His dark eyes reflected her face back at her. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady and clear, and the translation systems carried it to every seat in the chamber. She said that Earth respectfully declined the Galactic Accord. For a moment, nothing happened. The amphitheater was perfectly still, as if the station itself had stopped breathing. Then a low murmur began to spread through the tiers, rising in volume until it became a roar of voices in languages Elena could not understand. Voshan stared at her. His mandibles clicked once, twice, and then went still. He said nothing. Elena turned and walked back to her seat. Daniel was pale. Grace had her hand over her mouth. Ben Harris stood straighter and placed his hand near his sidearm, not drawing it, just making sure it was there. They left the amphitheater in silence. Behind them, the noise continued to grow. But Elena did not look back. She had said what needed to be said.